I want to talk about Bible prophecy. So many different angles you can talk about, and it's impossible to cover it all. I think we've got 6 sessions on Bible prophecy today, which is wonderful. And as I say, even 6 sessions won't cover all the stuff in the Bible. There's about, in my estimation, between a quarter and a third of the Bible is prophecy, and that makes it so much different from all other religious books. Because God tells us in advance what's going to happen. Jesus often, when he spoke to his disciples, said, in a nutshell, I'm telling you now so that when it happens, you won't get a shock. You'll be prepared. Forewarned is forearmed. Now, I'm going to do the impossible. I'm going to cover 100 years in 20 minutes. And I'm going to pick a particular line of talk rather than try and cover everything in the last 100 years. But I do want to cover the last 100 years in a couple of different angles, because there's so much happened in the last 100 years that if you don't sit and reflect on it every now and again, I think you lose sight of it. You just get caught up in the day-to-day. Oh, I think I'll have an iPhone 9. My iPhone 8's out of date. Whereas if you sit and look at what's happened in 100 years, I think you recognise that we are in a very dramatic time zone. And talking about time, I need to put my timer on, don't I? Okay, let me just quickly do this. Sorry. Okay. Now, because I'm going to try and cover 100 years in 20 minutes, and because, I'm going to blame Pastor Paul for this, because Pastor Paul said to me, look, you can amp it up a little bit if you like, you can make it a little bit more complex if you like, then I thought, great, I'll do it. So I'm not going to assume, that I have to put up every little simple step in the Bible. I'm just going to assume a lot of stuff, and I'll read out a lot of stuff or quote a lot of stuff. You will have to have your skates on, though. I suggest don't bother taking notes. I think it'll be a bit too fast to take notes. But hopefully if you've got your skates on, at the end of this, if you've been listening, you'll think to yourself, that's interesting. We've got to be somewhere near the end. And the question then really arises, are you ready? Are you ready? Yep, let's go. All right. Jesus was asked in Matthew 24, what should be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? The end of the world. And all of these things I'm going to talk about today relate to the end of the world. Unsaved people just don't believe there's an end of the world. They think the world's just going to go on forever. I don't know when the end of the world is. The world might limp along for another 700 years. I don't know. But I want to point out to you, there's so much material out there at the moment indicating the world has gone a little crazy and we're somewhere near the end of the world. In Luke 12, we read, as it was in the days of Lot, the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven. Do you think we're in an age where it's starting to look a little like Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, this is an age this has never ever happened before. That was last year, December last year. There's so many things happening, it's hard to keep track of them all. Who led the charge, by the way, with this unbelievable immorality? The British Israel, general band of countries. Think about it for a moment. Is this a theme that's popular in a place like, somewhere like Uganda or perhaps, Bolivia or something or other? The answer is no. The countries which have got gay marriage and have opened the door to a Pandora's box are places like Holland, Australia, New Zealand, USA, Great Britain, the Scandinavian type places and so on. Israel leads the world in sin yet again. What should be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? And Jesus answered, you shall hear of wars. And again, this is not my main theme today, but I want to point out to you, I could not put up all of the wars over the last 100 years. But I can just give you a quick snapshot that we've had 2 of the biggest wars in history. World War I, 16 million deaths. World War II is unquestionably the biggest war in history. Absolutely the biggest war in history. 2.5% of the world's entire population died. We think it was somewhere between 60 and 83 million people. It's just astonishing. Now, it's a long way back in history now. Maybe your dad fought in World War II. My dad did. And it seems so far away, but this is my last 100 years I'm talking about. He says, I'll show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke, a reference again to the end of the world. And we've gone from the age of bows and arrows and spears to 1945, the first nuclear weapon detonated, Trinity. The Bible then predicts that the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, the elements shall melt with fervent heat, the earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. And it does seem to fit that we're in an age now where we can potentially, everything can be burned up with nuclear weapons. 1952, first hydrogen bomb detonated. We've got bigger and better, of course. Jesus also included, you shall hear of wars and rumours of wars. Now, rumours of wars sounds fairly innocuous. They might go to war over in, Bosnia. They might go to war in, Colombia. But in fact, the word rumour has a slightly deeper meaning, and it seems to imply like a report or something which is potentially imminent rather than just a rumour. And I reckon we've had the biggest rumour of war for such a long time, of course, between 47 and 91, the Cold War. They built about 30,000 atom bombs. They had the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. In other words, you couldn't go to war because both parties would be destroyed. They therefore fought a series of proxy wars, the Korean War, the Cuba War, the Afghan War, etc., etc. Again, I suggest don't bother writing all this down. Just get a copy of it later on. It's just going to be too hard to keep up with. Ooh, 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 ooh. Stop it, my lord. Can we go? Is it up to me to go back? Yep, okay. Well, actually, guys, it might be easier if you took me back. I'm not very good at that. Preferably not one by one. It would be helpful if we went actually back to the point. I'm definitely not a technology person. Yes. Can we go back to where we were? That probably is about what I feel like right now. You find the spot where we were. A little, okay, that's it. A bit further. Okay. Shall I do it now? I'm not sure what I did wrong. Okay. All right, we've talked about a rumour of war, which is pretty amazing, and has left us, by the way, they built about 30,000 bombs. We've still got about 22,000 bombs, plus all sorts of other countries have entered into that race. This is kind of really what I take you back to 100 years and 4 months ago. Jerusalem should be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. That's written in Luke 21, as you see there on the bottom right. There are 3 basic chapters of prophecy of the end of the age. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, as spoken by Jesus. There's stacks and stacks of others, of course. 2 Timothy, the book of Revelation, 2 Thessalonians, and so on. And of course, in 1917, there was the release of Jerusalem. I'm not going to walk you through that because there is another talk on that, but I'm presuming that you've all got a pretty good grip on that. It's probably the most amazing prophecy in terms of detail given to us about the New Testament age. We received from the Lord the information about the year in 2 different systems. The actual date was given, the method using something like birds flying, aircraft. And it also has a great big punchy end time significance, which sometimes I don't think we quite grasp. This is the page in Haggai chapter 2 where we're given the date, the 9th of December. It's given under the old Hebrew calendar, and you'll see there we're told 3 times to think about it or consider it, and we're told 3 times the actual date, the 24th day of the 9th month, which in the year 1917, in the Hebrew calendar, was the 9th of December. But I'm not going to go through that, but the same chapter of Haggai chapter 2, his actual fundamental theme is actually quite different. The theme is, Verse 21, for example, speak to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow the kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen. For thus says the Lord of hosts, yet once, a little while, and I'll shake the heavens and the earth, and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations. And the desire of all nations shall come. That's Jesus, of course. And I'll fill this house with glory. You know, us being raised up to meet the Lord in the air. And this theme of I will shake the heavens and the earth once more, really big, end of the age, cataclysmic. Paul picks it up and uses it in the book of Hebrews, and it refers undoubtedly to Jesus coming back. So the whole bizzo about Allenby 1917 is actually kind of like a flag from the Lord. Are you watching? You're getting a signal that this is something to do with the Lord coming back, shaking all nations. Many people, of course, as I say, they're aware of his campaign in Palestine, but I want to just touch upon one or two other little aspects of this. I think I might have frozen this again, have I? Well done. Actually, shall I just say next? Is that the better? I'm probably pointing this in the wrong direction. Maybe I should go like this. If I go next, how about that? Okay. Many people realise that was the end of the war the following year, but in 1918, about 10 months later, he crushed the Turkish armies, the 7th and 8th armies in Palestine there, and he won the war. He not only won the war, he actually achieved something much, much bigger than that. And I just want to point that out for you. Who knows where he won his massive final battle? Next slide. At the hill of Megiddo in Israel. Now, Allenby, you notice his title, Field Marshal Viscount Edmund H. Allenby of Megiddo and Felixstowe. And people will sort of gloss over that, not realising that when Allenby got back, he was awarded a massive payment for his success in the war. I think it was £50,000. And he was given the title, the Viscount. And they asked him, what do you want to be Viscount of? And he said, I want to be Viscount of Megiddo. And they said, where's Megiddo? What's that? And he said, oh, that's where I won my last big battle. Allenby chose Megiddo as part of his title since its capture marked, he believed, the turning point of his final offensive. And you can read all the history books about this and they'll tell you exactly the same thing. That is from a history book, and that is, of course, hard to visualise for a moment, but the white is the land of Israel. The dotted line across the centre was the front. Below that were the British troops, Australian troops, New Zealand, Canadian and so forth. Above that were the Germans and Turks. If I've got the right pointer thing here, have I got it? No, doesn't work. You'll see the GHQ for the Turks up in the very top there. You'll see Jerusalem surrounded by the red circle there. And Allenby pretended he was attacking on the right-hand side along with Lawrence of Arabia. Yes, he's a real guy, plus all the Arabs. But instead, he tricked them. He'd march his army out all day towards the east in the daytime, big clouds of dust, and at night, he'd bring them all back again. And he did that for a couple of weeks. And the Germans were convinced that all of his cavalry were being assembled over in the east next to the desert. But in fact, he amassed them secretly on the west next to the coast there. And suddenly, in a great big attack, he plunged his troops forward. It was a big risk, and he won. He didn't just win, it was amazing. He conquered the entire 7th and 8th armies of the Turkish army in that basic battle there. And I guess what I want to point out to you is that, tongue-in-cheek, most of the historians refer to it as, up the top there, Armageddon, the 19th of September 1918. If you look at any record of that battle, you'll almost certainly find they all say the same sort of tongue-in-cheek joke, Armageddon, Allenby's War. This is the Australian War Memorial records in Canberra, the Battle of Armageddon. The plan of Allenby's attack is already a classic, blah, 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 blah. And although... There we go, we're back on. Although, of course, we know in the only reference in the Bible, Revelation chapter 16, he gathered them into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon, and right throughout secular society, we accept that is a reference to the end of the world, no problem at all. That's what most of us use it for. I reckon the Lord has hidden a subtle hint in that passage because we're told to kind of understand that this is a place where something amazing is going to happen. Next. And Armageddon, of course, means the hill of Megiddo in Hebrew, even though that's in the Greek language up there. Next slide. In the book of Revelation chapter 16, we're given 7 what they call vials, in other words, masses of destruction that God had planned, mainly for the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe. Vial number 1 starts around 1347. Vial number 5 finishes around 1870. Okay, you've got about 500 years there roughly that all of these massive destructions occur. Vial number 6 is basically the preparation for the end of the world, because we're told in a moment that this vial number 6 is so that we can bring all the world together for the great day of the battle of the Lord God Almighty. And by the way, that verse is not the one next to the Armageddon verse, it's 2 before it. In other words, God, I reckon, has given us a little hint that it's not actually necessarily exactly connected. When Allenby conquered Israel down there, what he was doing was he was technically conquering the entire Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, because by crushing them, that they would implode, and that's exactly what happened. And that precipitated the collapse of the German Empire, effectively. Allenby, once he'd conquered the 7th and 8th armies of the Turks, he then went north, conquered effectively the final 4th army of the Turks in Amman, a little bit north of there, and that was it. They were all over Red Rover. So this year marks the 100th anniversary. Now the Bible says the 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Now this is all symbolic language from the book of Revelation. We're not doctrinal about this. We're not saying this is how it absolutely has to be, but it seems a bit of a reasonable fit. Some of the things I'm going to say in a moment, maybe you've heard before, maybe you haven't heard before, but the river Euphrates, the final thing that God had to clear out of the way was in fact the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. He had to get rid of that to prepare everything in Palestine for the end of the world. And that's what I'm focusing on today. Now, when it collapsed in 1918, many pundits have pointed out this is a little like the Euphrates River drying up from the bottom right corner there up to the origins of the Euphrates River in Turkey. And that seems a reasonable way of looking at it. And it does seem a reasonable way of understanding what's going to come next. The Ottoman Empire was a very big empire. It lasted something like 500 years, very powerful, of course, Islamic, and dominated Jerusalem and the Middle East in that period. Now it says, when the 6th angel pours out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, symbolically, perhaps a reference to the Ottoman Empire collapsing, that the water was dried up. It says it was so that the kings of the East might be prepared. Next. Now, east of what? Normally in the Bible, east is a reference to east of Israel. The vertical line there is through Israel. East means countries that way. So is it true that after 1918, Allenby wrapping up the Ottoman Empire, that happened? And in fact, it is. Can you just press the button for me a few times? No, not that way. No. Yep, okay. So Turkey itself, independent 1919, next. You've got Jordan, 1923, next. Iran, 1925, next. Even as far away as Afghanistan there, 1919. Iraq, 1932, finally. Saudi Arabia, 1932. Syria, 1936. And stop there for a moment. In almost each of those cases, the country appointed a king, that the way of the kings of the East might be prepared. And becoming independent, as they all did, they all began developing their own views on what the state of Israel meant to them. And of course, you'd have to say that the general view is very, very hostile. Next. Now, while this is happening in countries to the east of Israel, what's actually happening in the land of Palestine with Allenby? Because something also begins there. Next slide. In 1918, during the spring of 1918, Allenby was visited by the three-man Zionist Commission headed by Weitzman. Weitzman is a very famous Jewish, he was a scholar, but he was a very famous man that was one of the guys that established and kicked off the World Zionist Organization. In other words, that Jewish group of people who had a political view that they should begin a state in Israel. It only happened sort of 20 years before this, but during World War I, he got permission. He was also involved heavily, by the way, in getting the Balfour Declaration written with the British Lord Balfour, the overseas fellow there. The Zionist purpose was to examine the possibilities of post-war Jewish settlement in Palestine. But Allenby's staff feared their arrival would encourage Arab agitation. Allenby agreed to the establishment of a Hebrew university in Jerusalem, despite his doubts about the timing and the feasibility of the project. "You have chosen the worst possible time," he told Weitzman. And without going through all the detail, poor old Allenby is struggling. He's trying to win a war, but he's got the members of the World Zionist Organization on his case the whole time, saying, "Can we just make this a bit more Jewish? Can we build a Jewish hospital here, a Jewish thing there," and so on and so on and so on. And it was, as it turned out, it was an interesting precursor, because from the end of World War I, Jewish migration to Palestine started to ramp up until eventually, by 1947, people were just arriving on boats, on ships. Next slide. Pretty happy, of course, getting away from the persecution during World War II in Europe. Next slide. Until eventually the State of Israel was declared in May 1948. Next slide. Brought great joy to them. Maybe a diversion. Next slide. Digression. Yes, a little digression for you. State of Israel, 1948. Next slide. Back in Matthew 24, the end of the world passage, Jesus says, "Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." Now Jesus didn't have to mention a fig tree, but he did. And you could say, well, maybe it was just a slip of the tongue, or it doesn't really matter at all. But most of what Jesus said is actually really, really important. And what's intriguing is, in the Bible, a tree was often used as an allegory for a nation or a clan. And next slide. The fig in particular, 1948, "The Lord showed me 2 baskets of figs, very good figs and very naughty figs. Like these good figs are the captive of Judah." Judah was the one that seemed to have the symbolism of the fig. So when we look at the parable of the fig tree, when its branch is tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh, is a reference to, well, in summer, of course, you collect figs, you harvest your figs. And what Jesus is implying here is it'll be time for harvesting. Elsewhere, Jesus gave us the expression, the harvest is the end of the world. Okay, next slide. So you have a state, Israel. In the centre of all the green area there, Israel is the one in the dark blue circle, tiny little country, not very big at all, and in the middle of an ocean of Muslim countries, an absolute ocean of them. Those countries in green are Muslim, mainly majority countries, but heavily influenced countries at least, but mainly majority countries. On top of that, it's happening all the time, that it just seems to be, the underlying problem is getting worse because, for example, just recently we noticed that the Jewish government announced that they have now succeeded in moving 1 million Jews across the border of Israel into what's called the West Bank, the captured territory from 1967. They say technically it's illegal to do so, to build something in an occupied land, but there are 1 million Jews who've built houses and flats and apartments. And you can just imagine if you're an Arab living there, right, how frustrating that would be, how demoralising it would be. Now, we're not political, we don't care. We're not pro-Jewish, anti-Arab, pro-American, anti-Russian, nothing like that. We're just simply pointing out this is the state of the world. This is what it's looking like. Now, naturally, this results in a lot of antagonism and hostility. This is Hamas down in the... There's two Arab sections attached to Israel. Gaza down in the bottom left-hand corner and the West Bank up on the top right-hand side. And in both areas, there's different levels of hostility and anger and frustration. And from their perspective, Israel is the terrorist. And the Middle East braces for war. The Middle East braces for war regularly. War after war after war after war after war. I think we've had 16 wars between the Israelis and neighbours up to now. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the number at the moment. And they refer to peace as the break between wars, if you know what I'm saying. Would I like to live there? No. I want to just pick up another little thread here. Back to Revelation 16, I call it the three frogs. Revelation 16. Now we saw the Armageddon verse in verse 16. There's also the end of the world when the seventh angel pours out his vial and says, it's all over, Red Rover. The preceding verses include the Euphrates River drying up verse, but this one also is there. I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. And for they are the spirits of devils working miracles which go forth to the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. So whatever these three things are, they're out there now apparently gathering everybody to battle. That's their job. Three unclean spirits, well, they're not actually frogs. Frogs sort of gives you the impression of something that multiplies quickly. You know, frogs have, when they lay eggs, they're by hundreds and by thousands, something that multiplies very quickly. And it says they're actually unclean spirits. We're told in the New Testament, the teaching on unclean spirits in the New Testament generally is about religion. For example, you read in the book of Timothy there, Paul talks about how the Spirit speaks expressly in the last days. It says they'll depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. In 1 John chapter 4, we're told about how believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they be of God. For many false prophets, false teachers have gone out into the world. It's religion, probably. That seems to make the most sense. And as I say, I'm not being dogmatic about this, just, as I say, because you're such an advanced class of learners, I'm just putting out there some ideas for you to think over. And there's the verse in the middle, behold, I come as a thief, blessed is he that watches or stays awake, keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. I think it's interesting that if we're talking about the end of the age, it's an age where the world is going to be pressing on you very hard, and Christians' job is to stay pure, to stay clean, to stay separate, and so on. This is also part of the signs of the end. Angel 6, Euphrates is drying up. Kings of the east are set free and become a dependent. 3 frogs and Armageddon. He says there's 3. It says they come out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Now, it's only because you're such an advanced class that I'm prepared to talk about this. The beast. Most people have no problem remembering, of course, the beast almost certainly is the Roman Catholic Church and her daughter churches, what we call nominal Christianity. Okay, Revelation chapter 13, Revelation chapter 17, Revelation chapter 18. Not going to waste your time going through that. The dragon is interesting. I mean, it could be the devil or something associated with him, but there is actually a specific dragon given to us in chapter 12. It says, a great red dragon. It says he's trying to kill the one who is going to be caught up to the right hand of God as soon as he's born. The guy that was doing that, of course, was King Herod. And Herod, although he died not long after Jesus was born, by the way, Herod left a legacy. He left a dynasty. There were 7 kings in his dynasty. He also occupied the land with his dynasty for about another 100 years or so. And Herod was not an Israelite. He wasn't a Jew even. He was an Edomite. He was from south of Israel. His father had treacherously betrayed the Jewish people to the Romans. He was therefore a red dragon, red Edom, Esau. He was great. He was Herod the Great. So he might possibly be the candidate there. What did he leave? The legacy he left was, if you look it up in your dictionary, people trying to kill Jesus were often the Pharisees and the Herodians. Who are the Herodians? You look it up and you'll find they are a Jewish political party adopting Greek customs. The false prophet, I can't give you a lot of other scripture about this, except Jesus said, watch out for false prophets that perhaps come to you from the desert. So I'm suggesting to you that perhaps that's a reasonable description of nominal Christianity, Islam and Judaism. The three powers, all the three religions that descended from Abraham. As I say, it takes too long to go through all of this in detail, but if that's the case, it says they gather together for the battle of the great day of God Almighty. That's the Pope in the middle, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, and on the right, the chief mufti of Jerusalem, having a meeting, trying to sort out their differences. That's a medieval depiction of Jerusalem above them when they all met in Jerusalem, trying to sort out their differences and find a way forward to peace. But instead, we just end up with drama after drama after drama. And let me point out too, most Muslims, Jews, nominal Christians are happy, down-to-earth, good citizens, no problem. It's usually the extremists of those religions that cause a problem. And you're saying to me, oh, what extremists were there in Christianity? Think Ireland back in the 1970s and the 1980s. People bombing funerals, Ireland, Protestants, Catholics. For the Jews, think the different gangs around the end of World War II there in Palestine. Why did the British leave Palestine? They got fed up with all their soldiers being killed by the Jewish freedom fighters. It was just a nightmare. So all three are guilty. Bali, of course, remember that. That was the WA one. And of course, the one that really set the cat amongst the pigeons, 2001. This has been happening since about 1972 with one of the earliest bombings of the embassy, the American embassy in Lebanon there. But 2001 was a massive, massive watershed. The reason I love chapter 16 of Revelation, by the way, is because it says, I saw in heaven another significant event. It was a great and marvellous, 7 angels holding the 7 last plagues, which bring God's wrath to completion. The 7 last plagues, this is to bring us to the end of God's wrath. It's the end of the world, whatever it is. And if I've got bits and pieces wrong, well, I'm sorry about that. But to bring it to the end of the world. Next. And we have President Donald Trump. Now, this is the last 12 months. Inaugurated last year in January. Next. Immediately bans Muslims from about 7 countries. Great idea. How to win friends and influence people. Whoa. He announced in advance that he was going to move the embassy of the USA from Tel Aviv down to Jerusalem, effectively putting support behind the idea that Jerusalem is the Jewish capital. The Arabs are furious. Nearly every former US ambassador disagrees with his decision. And that was an interesting article. Next. Am I doing it, am I? No. It's in part pushed, by the way, people don't realise, but Donald Trump himself is very, very pro-Israel. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner there, one of 3 leading lights in the White House. He's one of 3 senior counsel. He himself is a Jew, and when he married Trump's daughter, she converted to Judaism, and Trump put that son-in-law in charge of the peace process. Now, if you're an Arab sitting there, what are you going to think? You're going to think, hang on. This is not a level playing field anymore. Was it ever? But it's certainly not now. It's like putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. It just is not going to work. And next, we'll try and get through some of this. Next. I'm out of time, I know, but I'm just going to persevere for a moment. Fury across the Middle East as leaders condemn President Trump after he says Jerusalem is Israel's capital. Next. You would have seen this towards the end of last year. Frustration and fury amongst the Arabs at Trump's Jerusalem declaration. Next. This is the guy that runs the bottom left-hand corner, Gaza. Trump's Al-Quds means Jerusalem. Trump's Jerusalem move to ignite new Palestinian intifada. In other words, an Arab revolution. If he really does start breaking soil in Jerusalem for his embassy, you will start an Arab revolution. Next slide. Burning the flag, burning effigies of Trump. Next. Even a really moderate Muslim king, King Hussein, next to Israel, in Jordan there, warns that Trump against the embassy move. He just said it's so dumb. You've got no idea what you've just done. You've lit a fuse. Next. US blackmails Palestinian Authority to accept deal of the century. Trump keeps calling it the deal of the century. He's going to make peace in Israel. That's how he's going to do it. And what he's done, probably Jared Kushner again, but they've withdrawn funding from the support they gave to the Palestinian Authority, the guys up in the right bank. And they've done that to try and squeeze them, to make them follow their will. And the Israeli Prime Minister is happy. Next. But bitter Abbas to Trump, we reject your peace deal of the century. Next. Will those supporting Trump's deal of the century reconsider? Next. No, they won't. Next. Mahmoud Abbas meets Donald Trump in a key US visit. Now, this also was last year, 2017. And he went over to America, trying to enlist America's support. Can you help us try and organise peace and so forth? They had a really good chat together and so on. But if you think about the problems underlying Trump's perspective, by the way, Trump, by the way, has led the annual Jewish parade in New York as the Grand Marshal. I mean, it's hard to imagine. That's why Abbas was there. He was thinking, oh, this is crazy. Next slide. I want to remind you what the Bible says. The very last sign of the end of the age is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So the end sign, the very last sign, if you're looking for a last one, is not wars and rumours of wars, earthquakes, famines, all those sorts of things. It's when they declare peace and safety. And the place that they'll declare it is the Middle East. Obviously, that's the one that's causing the anxiety at the moment. The word safety, by the way, I've pointed out for you here, it means security. The modern English word would almost certainly be security. When they call peace and security. Next. So Trump meets with Abbas, and there's this great long verbatim transcript of the speech he gave. And it's, you're a lovely bloke, we're lovely blokes, we're going to help you, we're going to do this. The usual sort of political mumbo-jumbo. But I just want to point something out to you. Now, this is the same page with a couple of words circled. Peacemaker, peace for peace, a peace agreement, security, peace, security, and peace. Next page, same discussion. Peace, security, peace. Next page. Peace, security, peace, security, peace, and security. Peace. Next page. This is Trump speaking. Can't quite read that one. I think it's peace up in the right-hand corner there. Peace, security, peace. Next page, I think that's the final one. Concluding with peace. President Abbas's response, okay. President Trump, good, thank you. Good night, nurse. Next slide. This is another feature of the last 12 months. Most American presidents make a big deal of whichever country they go to visit first. Most of them will either visit somewhere like England or Germany, perhaps even Japan. President Trump selected Saudi Arabia because, quote, I'm a great friend of the Muslims. Israel because, quote, he's a great friend of the Jews. And he went to the Vatican. He actually didn't want to go there, but that was his first overseas trip. Next slide. And I suspect there's a touch of the three frogs here again. Next slide. Donald Trump's risky religious pilgrimage. Everyone knew it was based on trying to get the religions to harmonise. Next slide. In Arabia, next slide. in Israel. And again, I've been naughty and circled all the peace. Come to set peace, 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 peace. Security, next slide. That's him at the Wailing Wall, by the way. Again, that's him in the meeting with Netanyahu. Peace again, next slide. Now, going to meet the Pope was really interesting because he said so many nasty things about the Pope. He really doesn't like the guy. And everyone thought he won't actually go there. But he went to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and then he did go to the Vatican. And everybody was amazed. Next slide. Pope asks Trump to be peacemaker. Next slide. Trump determined to pursue peace after Pope meeting. Next slide. Pope asks Trump to be peacemaker and gives him an environmental letter. I hope it was written on recycled paper. Next slide. Trump vows to pursue peace after meeting with Pope. Next slide. Trump promises peace push after fantastic Pope talks. Next slide. I reckon I can see three frogs everywhere in this story. Next slide. That's from another paper. Will President Trump bring peace to Israel? All those are thinking, Will, put your hand up. All the rest, put your hand up. These are signs of the end of the age. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire, predicted in Revelation 16. The countries becoming independent on the east of Israel. The rise and the influx of the state of Israel, 1948, finally comes to pass. And then turmoil around the world as people grapple with this very, very deep hostility between the Jews and the Arabs. And the Christians trying to butt their noses in, trying to help everybody find peace. Next slide. Yeah, I know I'm finished. But of that day and hour knows no man, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Next slide. When these things begin to come to pass, look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh. Next slide. I guess the question is, are you ready? Next slide. Because I'm pretty sure you're living in the last days. And all the people said.